The shot was fired at 4:30 in the morning on October 30th, 1955. It echoed through a Georgian mansion in Oyster Bay on Long Island's North Shore, a place called the Playhouse. The name suggested leisure and elegance. What happened inside suggested something darker, something that would haunt New York society for decades. Ann Woodward told police she thought her husband was a prowler. She said she grabbed the shotgun from beside her bed. She said she fired in the dark. She said she had no idea it was him. William Woodward Jr., heir to one of America's great banking fortunes, died on the floor of his own home. He was 35 years old. His wife became the most famous widow in the country. The newspapers called it the shooting of the century. But the questions that followed would never be answered. Was it an accident? Was it self-defense? Or was it something else entirely? And why did the people who knew the most say the least? If you find yourself drawn to stories of wealth, mystery, and the hidden forces that shape powerful families, please subscribe now. What comes next will stay with you long after the story ends. The night began with a party. Not at the Playhouse. Somewhere else. Somewhere that felt safer. William and Ann Woodward had attended a dinner hosted by George and Edith Baker, neighbors who lived just down the road. The evening was pleasant, unremarkable. The guests were the kind of people who appeared in the society pages without trying. Old money, established names, families whose fortunes had been built 2 or 3 generations earlier and were now simply maintained. The kind of crowd that valued discretion above almost everything else. The Woodwards arrived separately. They left separately. This was not unusual for them. Many couples of their class maintained a certain distance even in public. Separate bedrooms, separate schedules, separate lives running parallel within the same marriage. Privacy was a form of respect in that world. Or perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was the only way some marriages survived. The party ended around midnight. The guests filtered out into the cool October night. William and Ann drove home in separate cars. Ann arrived first. She parked. She walked through the front door. She went upstairs. William followed minutes later. He parked his car. He entered the house. He went to his own bedroom. Both went to bed, in separate rooms, on opposite sides of the second-floor hallway. This was their routine. It had been for some time. What happened between midnight and 4:30 in the morning remains one of the great mysteries of 20th century American society. The house sat on 70 acres of carefully manicured land. It had been built in 1916 by William Woodward Sr. as a guest house on the Bel Air estate. The main mansion was larger, more formal, but the Playhouse had its own character. 11 rooms, high ceilings, tall windows that looked out over the grounds. Everything about it suggested permanence, stability, the kind of place where nothing bad could happen. That night, everything changed. The estate itself was part of a larger world. Oyster Bay was home to some of the wealthiest families in America. The Roosevelts had lived there, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys. These were not new fortunes. These were dynasties, and the Woodwards were among them. The Oyster Bay area had been unsettled for weeks leading up to that night. A prowler had been reported in the neighborhood. Someone had been seen moving through the darkness near the great estates, slipping between properties, looking into windows, trying door handles. No one had been harmed. Nothing had been stolen. But the reports were consistent enough to cause alarm. Residents were nervous. Some had hired additional security. Others had begun keeping weapons close. The police had increased patrols, but the prowler had not been caught. And the sightings continued. Ann Woodward kept a double-barreled shotgun beside her bed. She would later say that William had told her to keep it there, that he had told her to use it if she heard anything suspicious, that he had been worried about the prowler reports, that he wanted her to be able to protect herself. Whether this was true would become a matter of debate. At some point in the early hours of October 30th, Anne woke. She would later say she heard a noise, a sound that did not belong, something outside her window, or perhaps in the hallway. She reached for the shotgun. She stood. She moved toward the sound. The house was dark. She did not turn on the lights. She walked carefully, quietly, listening. And then she saw a figure, a shape in the darkness, moving in the hallway outside her bedroom door. She raised the gun. She fired. The blast tore through the silence. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space. Deafening. Final. William Woodward Jr. fell. He had been walking toward his wife's room, or perhaps he had been walking past it. Perhaps he had heard the same noise she heard. Perhaps he was checking the house. Perhaps he was coming to tell her everything was fine. No one would ever know for certain. He died almost instantly. The shotgun blast had struck him in the head and chest at close range. There was no chance of survival. Anne called the police. The exact timing of the call would later be disputed. But it came quickly. Her voice on the phone was described as calm. Too calm, some would later say. She told the operator there had been an accident. She said she had shot her husband. She said she thought he was a prowler. She said she had made a terrible mistake. The operator dispatched officers immediately. The Oyster Bay Police Department was small. This was not the kind of place where violent crime occurred. The officers who responded that morning were walking into something they had never encountered before. The police arrived within minutes. They found Anne in a state that appeared to be shock. She was dressed in a nightgown. Her hands were shaking. She was crying. The shotgun lay on the floor near William's body. The scene was immediately secured. Photographs were taken. Measurements were recorded. Statements were collected. Anne repeated her story. She had heard a noise. She had feared an intruder. She had grabbed the gun that William had told her to keep loaded. She had seen a figure in the dark. She had fired. She had not known it was her husband until it was too late. The police noted that William had been shot at close range. They noted that Anne's story was consistent. They also noted something else. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. No broken windows, no jimmied locks, no evidence of any prowler. The neighborhood scare had been real. Multiple people had reported seeing someone. But no intruder had been found. And no intruder had been in the house that night. The investigation began immediately, but it began under unusual circumstances. The Woodward family was not just wealthy. They were connected. William Woodward Sr. was the chairman of the Hanover Bank, one of New York's most prestigious financial institutions. He sat on corporate boards. He knew governors and senators. He moved in circles where power was exercised quietly. His wife, Elsie, was equally formidable. She came from the Crider family, another pillar of New York society. Old money. The kind of lineage that mattered in rooms where new fortunes were viewed with suspicion. Their son had been groomed from birth for a life of privilege and responsibility, and now he was dead, shot by his own wife, in his own home. The implications were staggering. The Woodward family closed ranks immediately. Lawyers were called. Statements were prepared. The family made it clear that they expected the investigation to be thorough. But they also made it clear that they expected discretion. This was a private tragedy, not a public spectacle. The police understood the message. This was not a case that could be handled carelessly. Every step would be watched. Every decision would be scrutinized. The pressure was immense, and it came from every direction. If this story has pulled you in, consider subscribing. The deeper we go, the stranger it becomes, and you won't want to miss what comes next. William Woodward Jr. had been born into extraordinary privilege on February 20th, 1920. His childhood was spent in mansions, his education at the finest schools. He attended Groton, the elite boarding school in Massachusetts that had educated Franklin Roosevelt and countless other members of America's ruling class. Then Harvard, where he studied history and economics, where he rode crew, where he made connections that would last a lifetime. His future seemed predetermined. He would join his father's bank. He would marry someone appropriate. He would raise children who would continue the family name. He would live the life that had been planned for him before he was born. And for a while, it seemed he would do exactly that. World War II interrupted those plans. William enlisted in the Navy. He served with distinction. He saw action in the Pacific Theater. He received commendations. The war changed him in ways that were difficult to articulate. He came back different, quieter, more serious, or perhaps just more aware that the world his family inhabited was not the only world. That privilege was not the same as purpose. That comfort could feel like a cage. He returned to New York in 1943, and almost immediately, he made a decision that shocked his family. He married Anne Crowell. Anne Crowell had been born in Pittsburgh in November of 1915. Her early life was nothing like William's. Her father died when she was young. Her mother remarried a man named Sims. The family moved to Kansas. Anne grew up in modest circumstances. Not poor, but not wealthy. She was beautiful from an early age, strikingly so. Dark hair, sharp features, a presence that made people turn and look. She understood early that beauty was currency, and she intended to spend it wisely. She left Kansas as soon as she could. She moved to New York in her early 20s. The city was full of beautiful young women with ambition. But Anne had something more. She had intelligence, she had determination, and she had no illusions about how the world worked. She found work as a showgirl. She performed in clubs. She modeled. She was photographed at parties and nightclubs. She was seen with men who had money. She dated a radio announcer named Stanley Grafton Jr. The relationship was serious enough that they married in 1941. But it did not last. They divorced within a year. Anne was looking for something more than a radio announcer could provide. She was looking for security, for status, for a way into a world that did not want her. And then she met William Woodward Jr. The meeting happened in 1943. William was stationed in New York. Anne was performing at a club. The details of their first encounter are lost to time. But the attraction was immediate. William was handsome, educated, wealthy beyond anything Anne had ever known. Anne was beautiful, magnetic, unlike anyone William had ever met in his carefully controlled social circles. They began seeing each other. Within weeks, he proposed. His family was horrified. Elsie Woodward made her feelings brutally clear. Anne was not suitable. She did not come from the right background. She had been married before. She worked in nightclubs. She would embarrass the family. She would damage the Woodward name. William should end the relationship immediately. William refused. The wedding took place on April 30th, 1943. It was a small ceremony, almost secretive. The Woodward family did not attend. William's parents made their absence a statement. This marriage did not have their blessing. Anne understood what that meant. She was marrying into a family that despised her, that would never accept her, that would spend the rest of her life waiting for her to fail. The marriage began under a cloud of disapproval. It would never escape that shadow. The first years were difficult in ways Anne had not anticipated. She had imagined that marrying William would open doors, that she would be welcomed into New York society, that her beauty and charm would win people over. She was wrong. The world she had married into had rules, and one of the most important rules was that outsiders stayed outside. It did not matter how perfectly she dressed, how gracefully she behaved, how carefully she learned the customs and the manners and the unspoken codes. She would always be the showgirl who had trapped William Woodward Jr. She would always be the gold digger who had married above her station. She would always be that woman. Elsie Woodward made sure of it. The relationship between Anne and her mother-in-law was cold from the beginning, polite in public, hostile in private. Elsie referred to Anne as that woman when speaking to friends. She made it clear that Anne's presence at family gatherings was tolerated only because of William, that she was not truly family, that she never would be. Anne responded by trying harder. She studied how the other women dressed and copied them. She read the society pages to learn which charities mattered. She hired tutors to improve her speech. She threw herself into the role of society wife with the same determination she had brought to everything else in her life. She became, by all outward appearances, exactly what she was supposed to be. But the effort was exhausting, and the acceptance she sought never came. William and Anne had 2 sons. William Woodward III, called Woody, was born in 1944. James was born in 1947. The boys were raised with nurses and tutors. They attended the best schools. They spent summers in the Hamptons and winters in Palm Beach. They were being prepared for the life their father had lived, the life their grandfather had lived. They were Woodwards, and Woodwards had certain responsibilities, certain expectations. Anne loved her children, but she also understood that they were part of the bargain she had made. They were proof that she belonged, that she had fulfilled her duty, that she was not just William's wife but the mother of the next generation. But the marriage was unraveling. William drank more than he should. He stayed out late. He spent long hours at the stables. He was passionate about horse racing. He owned several thoroughbreds. He poured money and attention into breeding and training racehorses. It was the one part of his life where he seemed genuinely happy, where the pressure of being a Woodward did not weigh on him constantly. His prize horse was named Nashua, a beautiful colt with speed and stamina. William believed Nashua could become one of the greatest racehorses in American history. He was probably right, but he would never see it happen. William also had affairs. Some were discreet, brief encounters that society wives were expected to ignore. Others were more serious. He was seen with other women at clubs, at restaurants. He made little effort to hide his infidelity. Anne knew. She tolerated it at first. The rules of their world suggested that a wife looked the other way, that she maintained appearances, that she did not make scenes, that marriage in their class was about partnership and dynasty, not romance. But Anne was not someone who accepted humiliation quietly. She had fought for everything she had. She had clawed her way out of Kansas and into one of the great families of New York. She was not going to lose it all because William could not control himself. By the early 1950s, the marriage had become a performance. They appeared together at the right events. They smiled for photographers at charity galas. They maintained the fiction of a happy union. Behind closed doors, they barely spoke. They lived in the same houses but occupied different worlds. William had his horses. Anne had her sons and her increasingly desperate attempts to maintain her social position. They had separate bedrooms, separate schedules, separate lives. The marriage was intact only in name. And barely that. The night of October 29th, 1955, was not unusual by the standards of their relationship. The Bakers' dinner party was the kind of event the Woodwards attended regularly. The guests were familiar faces from their social circle. The conversation was pleasant and meaningless. No one who was there that night reported any tension between William and Anne. They seemed, by all accounts, like any other couple in their circle. Comfortable, detached, performing their roles with practiced ease. They spoke to different people. They moved through the rooms separately. They left in separate cars. This was noted later. Why had they driven separately? Some suggested it was practical. They had come from different locations earlier in the day. Others suggested it was symbolic. Two people living parallel lives, sharing a name, sharing a home, sharing nothing else that mattered. What happened between midnight and 4:30 in the morning on October 30th remains the central mystery. Anne said she went to bed. She said she heard a noise sometime later. She said she was frightened because of the prowler reports. She said she grabbed the shotgun. She said she saw a figure in the dark hallway. She said she fired. William said nothing. He could not. The only certainty is that at 4:30, a shotgun blast shattered the silence of the playhouse, and William Woodward Jr. was dead on the floor. Everything else is interpretation. Everything else is theory. Everything else is speculation built on silence and circumstantial evidence and the word of a woman who had every reason to lie. The police investigation moved quickly. Too quickly, some would later say. Anne was questioned repeatedly in those first hours. She repeated her story each time without significant variation. She had heard a noise. She had been afraid. She had grabbed the gun. She had fired at what she thought was an intruder. She had not realized it was William until she saw his body. She was devastated. She was in shock. She could not believe what had happened. The police processed the scene. They photographed the body. They documented the position of the shotgun. They measured distances. They interviewed the household staff who had been sleeping in other parts of the house and heard the shot. They canvassed the neighborhood asking about the prowler. They did everything that protocol demanded. But they were also aware that this was not an ordinary case. The district attorney was a man named Frank Gullotta. He was relatively young for the position. Ambitious. He understood that the Woodward case would define his career one way or another. If he charged Anne and lost, he would be finished. If he charged her and won, he would be famous. If he declined to charge her and the public believed she was guilty, he would be condemned as corrupt. He reviewed the evidence carefully. He interviewed witnesses. He consulted with forensic experts. He met with the Woodward family lawyers. And he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Subscribe now, if you haven't already, because what comes next is where the story gets truly strange. And you won't believe where it ends. On November 7th, 1955, just 8 days after the shooting, District Attorney Frank Gullotta held a press conference. He announced that no charges would be filed against Anne Woodward. He called the shooting a tragic accident. He said there was no evidence of criminal intent. He said that Anne Woodward had acted in reasonable fear for her safety, given the prowler reports in the area. He said that charging her would serve no purpose. He said the case was closed. The reaction was immediate, and it was divided along predictable lines. Some believed Gullotta had made the right decision. They believed Anne's story. They believed that a frightened woman had made a terrible mistake in the dark, that the prowler reports were real, that William had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, that tragedy was not the same as crime. Others believed something very different. They believed that Anne had planned it, that she had waited until the perfect moment, that she had used the prowler scare as cover for premeditated murder, that she had killed her husband deliberately and then lied about it, and they believed that the Woodward family had used their influence to protect her, not because they cared about Anne, but because a murder trial would have been a scandal. And scandals were not tolerated. The question of what the Woodward family believed became a matter of intense speculation. William Woodward Sr. said nothing publicly. He was 75 years old. His only son was dead. Whether he believed Anne was guilty or innocent, he understood that a trial would destroy what remained of the family's reputation. Better to close the case quietly. Better to let Anne disappear into obscurity. Better to focus on protecting the grandsons and preserving the family name. Elsie Woodward felt differently. Those close to her reported that she believed Anne was guilty, that she believed her son had been murdered, and that she believed justice had been denied because money and influence had intervened. Elsie never spoke to Anne again after the shooting. Not once. Not ever. The two women attended the funeral on separate sides of the church. William was buried at the Woodward family plot. The service was private. Only family and close friends were invited. Anne sat with her sons. Elsie sat with her husband and other relatives. They did not acknowledge each other. They did not speak. The divide was absolute. Anne had killed Elsie's son. Whether by accident or by design, the result was the same. And Elsie would never forgive her. The relationship between grandmother and daughter-in-law was severed permanently on that October morning. What remained was a cold legal arrangement regarding the grandsons. Elsie saw Woody and James regularly, but she never again allowed Anne into her home. The question of motive became the center of every private conversation in New York society. Why would Anne have killed William? If she had killed him, if it was not an accident, the most common theory involved money and status. William's will left everything to his sons in trust. If he died, Anne would have control of their inheritance until they came of age. She would live comfortably. She would remain Mrs. William Woodward Jr. She would keep access to the houses, the staff, the social position. Everything she had fought so hard to achieve. But if she divorced, she would lose it all. The prenuptial agreement was clear and brutal. She would receive a modest settlement, nothing close to what she had become accustomed to, and she would be cast out of New York society. Divorce would mean returning to the life she had escaped, back to obscurity, back to being nobody. Some believed this was motive enough, that the fear of losing everything had driven her to murder. Others pointed to the humiliation. William's affairs had become increasingly public. He was seen with other women. He made little effort to hide his infidelity. Anne had endured it for years, but there were limits to what even she could tolerate. Some believed that rage, not calculation, had driven her, that the shooting was not premeditated but impulsive. A moment of fury disguised as fear, that she had simply reached her breaking point, that she had grabbed the gun and fired and then constructed the prowler story afterward. This theory was harder to prove. But it had a certain psychological logic. Marriages ended in violence every day. Why should the Woodwards be different? Still others believed it truly was an accident, that a woman terrified by reports of a prowler had made a tragic mistake, that the timing was coincidental, that William had been checking the house at the same moment Anne had been responding to a noise, that they had encountered each other in the dark, and she had fired before recognizing him, that no one should be condemned for a moment of panic. This was the official version, the version that Gulata had endorsed, the version that closed the case. But even people who believed it was an accident acknowledged how convenient it was for Anne, that her husband's death solved all her problems, that she emerged from tragedy with everything she had feared losing. The truth remained elusive, because the only two people who knew what happened were William and Anne. And William was dead. Anne told her story. The police had accepted it. The district attorney had declined to prosecute. The case was closed. But closing a case is not the same as answering questions. and the questions would follow Ann Woodward for the rest of her life. The months after the shooting were brutal. Ann became the most famous woman in New York, but not in the way she had once hoped. She was no longer the beautiful wife of a banking heir. She was the woman who had killed her husband. Whether by accident or design, she was marked. Photographers followed her everywhere. Reporters called constantly. The society pages that had once celebrated her appearances at galas now dissected every detail of her life. What she wore, where she went, who she spoke to. Every outfit was analyzed. Every expression was interpreted. She was called a murderer in whispered conversations. She was called a gold digger. She was called worse. And she had no defense, because defending herself would mean talking about the shooting, and talking about the shooting would keep the story alive. She retreated from public life. She stopped attending parties. She stopped appearing at charity events. She stayed inside the houses that had once been her pride. The Fifth Avenue apartment, the Oyster Bay estate. She focused on her sons. Woody was 11 when his father died. James was 8. They were old enough to understand that something terrible had happened, old enough to hear the whispers, old enough to know that their mother had killed their father. Whether it was an accident or not, that was the reality they lived with. Anne tried to shield them, but there was no shielding them from the truth. Their childhood was over. The Woodward family made arrangements for the boys. They would continue at their schools. They would spend time with their grandmother. They would be raised with every advantage, but they would also carry the weight of that October morning for the rest of their lives. They were the sons of a man who had been shot by their mother. They were the grandsons of a family that believed their mother was a murderer. They were heirs to a fortune built on banking and horse racing and tragedy. What that did to them psychologically is something only they could say, and they chose never to say it publicly. Anne waited for the attention to fade. She believed that if she stayed quiet, the story would eventually die, that people would move on to the next scandal, that she could rebuild some version of her life. She was wrong. The story did not fade. It became part of New York mythology. The shooting at the Playhouse, the Woodward scandal, the case that was never solved. It was discussed at dinner parties. It was referenced in society columns. It hung over Anne like a permanent shadow. Everywhere she went, people knew who she was and what she had done, or what they believed she had done. Years passed. Anne remained in New York. She maintained a lower profile than before, but she did not disappear. She could not disappear. Leaving would have been an admission of guilt. It would have meant surrendering the identity she had built. So she stayed. She attended fewer events. She saw fewer people. But she remained Mrs. William Woodward Jr. She remained part of the world she had fought so hard to enter, even if that world had turned against her. The 1960s brought changes. William Woodward Sr. died in 1953. Elsie followed in 1970. The older generation was gone. The people who had hated Anne most fiercely were dead. But the story remained, and new players were about to enter. One of them was a writer named Truman Capote. Truman Capote had been watching Anne Woodward for years. The writer was fascinated by her. He had known her slightly through mutual acquaintances. He had seen her at parties before the shooting. He had watched her perform the role of society wife with what he recognized as perfect artifice. And he had always suspected there was something beneath the surface, something darker, something worth writing about. In the early 1970s, Capote began working on what he promised would be his masterpiece, a novel called Unanswered Prayers. It was meant to be a devastating portrait of New York high society, the people he had known, the secrets he had kept, the truth behind the carefully maintained facades, he began publishing excerpts in Esquire magazine in 1975. One chapter was called La Côte Basque, 1965. It was set in the famous New York restaurant. It featured thinly disguised versions of real people from Capote's social circle. And it included a character named Ann Hopkins. The character was a former showgirl who had married into a powerful family. Her husband had been shot under mysterious circumstances. She had claimed it was an accident. Everyone who read the chapter knew exactly who it was based on. Capote had changed the name. He had altered a few details, but he had changed nothing that mattered. The portrait was devastating, cruel, and unmistakably about Ann Woodward. Capote wrote that Ann Hopkins had deliberately killed her husband, that she had planned it carefully, that the Prowler story was a lie, that she had gotten away with murder because of money and influence, and a society that protected its own. He wrote it as fiction, but everyone understood it was fact. Or at least what Capote believed to be fact. The chapter appeared in the November 1975 issue of Esquire. Ann Woodward read it. She was 60 years old. She had spent 20 years living under the shadow of that October morning. She had never been charged. She had never been convicted. She had been cleared by the district attorney. But she had never been forgiven. Not by society. Not by the Woodward family. And now Truman Capote was telling the world that she was a murderer. On October 10th, 1975, Ann Woodward took her own life. She was found in her apartment on Fifth Avenue. She had swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills. There was no note, no explanation, no final statement. Her sons were the ones who found her. The timing was not lost on anyone. October 10th, 20 years and 10 days after the shooting, almost to the hour. Whether this was deliberate or coincidental, no one could say. But the symbolism was impossible to ignore. 2 decades after killing her husband, Ann Woodward had killed herself, or so it appeared. Truman Capote expressed no regret when he heard the news. He told friends that Ann had killed herself because she was guilty, that innocent people did not commit suicide over fiction, that her death was a confession, that he had been right all along. Others saw it very differently. They saw a woman who had been condemned without trial, who had been hounded by rumor and suspicion for 20 years, who had endured whispers and accusations and the knowledge that half of New York believed she was a murderer, who had finally decided that the weight of it all was too much to carry, that Capote's chapter had been the final cruelty, the final humiliation, the thing she could not survive. The question of why Ann killed herself, if she did kill herself, would be debated as intensely as the question of whether she had killed William. Some believed it was guilt, that she had lived with the knowledge of what she had done for 20 years, and Capote's chapter had made it impossible to continue. Others believed it was despair, that she had been destroyed by a society that never forgave, that she had been driven to suicide by decades of judgment and isolation. And some believed it was calculation, that she chose to die on her own terms rather than face another round of public scrutiny, that she took control of her death the way she had tried to take control of her life. The Woodward family issued no statement about Ann's death. Elsie had died 5 years earlier. William Sr. had been gone for more than 2 decades. The sons, Woody and James, said nothing publicly. They arranged a quiet funeral. Ann was buried without fanfare. The society columns that had once tracked her every move reported her death in a few brief paragraphs. And then she was gone. Forgotten by the world she had fought so hard to enter. Remembered only as the woman who had killed William Woodward Jr., whether by accident or design. The estate was divided among her sons. They inherited what remained of the Woodward fortune. They were raised by trustees and distant relatives after Anne's death. They grew up knowing their father had been killed by their mother. Whether by accident or intent, the result was the same. They were orphans, raised by a legacy of violence and silence. They did not speak publicly about their parents. They did not give interviews. They did not write memoirs. They disappeared into the kind of quiet wealth that does not need to announce itself. Perhaps that was the only way to survive. Nashua, William's prize racehorse, went on to become one of the greatest champions of the 1950s. He won the Preakness Stakes. He won the Belmont Stakes. He earned over $1 million in purses, an enormous sum for that era. He was later inducted into the Racing Hall of Fame. He became exactly what William had believed he could become. But William never saw it. He had died just as Nashua's career was beginning. The horse became a monument to what might have been, a legacy of excellence overshadowed by tragedy. The Woodward family eventually sold Bel Air and all its holdings. The era of the great racing stables was ending, and the Woodward name would not continue in that world. The question of what really happened on the morning of October 30th, 1955, has never been answered. Not definitively, not in a way that satisfies everyone. The district attorney said it was an accident. The Society Whispers said it was murder. Anne said it was fear. Elsie said it was calculation. Truman Capote said it was guilt. The evidence suggested all of it, and none of it. The shotgun was real. The prowler scare was real. Anne's fear may have been real, but so was her motive. So was the timing. So was the fact that she fired at close range in the dark and hit her target with devastating accuracy. In the decades since, the case has been re-examined countless times. Writers have investigated, documentaries have been produced, theories have been proposed and debated. Some believe the shooting was staged, that Anne lured William into the hallway, that she positioned herself perfectly, that she fired knowing exactly what she was doing, that the prowler story was constructed in advance as cover. This theory requires premeditation. It requires cold calculation. It requires believing that Anne was capable of murder, and that she was smart enough to get away with it. Others believe it was a tragic coincidence, that William had risen to check on the same noise Anne heard, that they both reacted to the same fear, that they encountered each other in the dark, that Anne fired in panic, that the gun went off in a moment of confusion and terror. This theory requires believing that the timing was simply catastrophic bad luck, that all the elements came together in the worst possible way, that no one was to blame because blame requires intent, and some believe it was neither pure accident nor pure murder, that the truth lies somewhere in between, a moment of ambiguity that can never be fully resolved, that Anne heard a noise and grabbed the gun, that she saw William and recognized him, but that in that split second, she made a choice, that the fear was real, but so was the opportunity, that she fired knowing it was him, knowing what it would mean, knowing she could claim it was an accident. This theory is the most disturbing, because it suggests that murder can happen in a moment, that it does not require planning, that it requires only opportunity and motive, and the willingness to act. What remains after all the theories and investigations and debates is the silence. The Woodward family never spoke publicly about the shooting, not in any detail, not in any way that revealed what they truly believed. The sons never gave interviews, they never wrote books, they never broke their silence. The servants who were in the house that night were never called to testify because there was no trial. The neighbors who attended the party were never asked what they had seen or heard. The investigation was brief. The conclusion was swift, and the case was closed before any deeper questions could be asked. In a world where wealth and influence could buy almost anything, silence was perhaps the most valuable purchase of all. The Woodward family bought silence. They bought discretion. They bought a closed case and a quiet burial, and the promise that the story would fade. They did not succeed completely. The story did not fade, but it was contained, controlled, kept within acceptable boundaries. There was no trial, no public spectacle, no headlines that ran for months. Just a quick investigation, and a brief statement, and a society that moved on because it was told to move on. Anne Woodward spent 20 years living with the consequences of that silence. She remained in New York. She attended fewer parties, but she never left. Leaving would have been an admission. Leaving would have meant surrendering the life she had built. So she stayed, and she endured. She endured the whispers, the stares, the knowledge that everywhere she went, people were talking about her, speculating, judging. She endured until Truman Capote made endurance impossible. His betrayal was not legal. He did not accuse her in court. He accused her in print, in fiction that everyone understood as fact, and in doing so, he destroyed what little remained of her life. Capote's own life unraveled after answered prayers. The excerpts he published in Esquire ended his career as a member of high society. The people he had written about, the people who had trusted him, turned against him. He was cast out of the world he had chronicled. He spent the last years of his life isolated, drinking, working on a novel he would never finish. He died in 1984, alone. The manuscript of Answered Prayers remained incomplete. Only a few chapters were ever published. The rest, if they existed, were lost or destroyed. The novel that was supposed to be his masterpiece became instead a symbol of betrayal and self-destruction. The chapter about Anne Hopkins was one of the last pieces of significant writing Capote produced. It was brilliant, cruel, sharp, devastating, and ultimately unforgivable. Whether it was true is a question that cannot be answered. Capote believed it was true. He believed Anne had murdered William. He believed she had gotten away with it. And he believed the world deserved to know. But belief is not the same as proof, and fiction is not the same as justice. What Capote did was execute Anne Woodward in print, and she responded by executing herself in fact. The playhouse still stands. It is privately owned now. The estate was sold decades ago. The new owners do not discuss its history. They do not give tours. They do not acknowledge what happened there. The gardens are maintained. The windows are cleaned. The rooms where William died have been repainted many times. The blood is long gone, the physical evidence erased. But the past does not leave. It lingers in the architecture, in the layout of the rooms, in the hallway where Anne fired the shot that changed everything. The house is beautiful, well kept, expensive, and haunted by a story that will never be forgotten. The North Shore of Long Island is full of estates like the Playhouse, houses built by families whose names once meant something, whose fortunes shaped industries, whose influence extended into government and finance and culture. Many of those estates have been sold. Some have been torn down. Others have been converted into schools or museums or corporate retreats. The world they represented is gone. The Gilded Age ended. The rules changed. The power shifted. But the houses remain. And the stories remain. And the Woodward story remains the darkest of them all. What do we take from this? What lesson is there in a tragedy so tangled in wealth and secrecy and silence? Perhaps it is this, that the structures built to protect privilege can also trap those inside them. that the pressure to maintain appearances can crush the people who bear it, that the cost of living a lie is sometimes too high to pay. Anne Woodward wanted to belong. She wanted to be accepted. She wanted to prove that she was worthy of the name she had taken. And in the end, she was destroyed by the very world she had fought so hard to enter. Whether she killed her husband deliberately or accidentally, she was condemned. Condemned by a society that never truly accepted her. Condemned by a family that believed the worst. Condemned by her own choices and the circumstances that flowed from them. She lived 20 years under that condemnation. And when Truman Capote made it public, when he turned suspicion into published accusation, she chose to end it. Whether that was guilt or despair or simply exhaustion, only she knew. And she left no explanation. William Woodward Jr. is remembered as a victim, and he was. But he was also a man who lived carelessly, who married a woman his family despised, who drank and cheated and spent his nights at the stables while his marriage collapsed, who kept a loaded shotgun in a house with a wife he barely spoke to. He was a victim of violence, but he was also complicit in creating the circumstances that led to that violence. The marriage was broken long before the gun was fired, and both of them knew it. The shot that killed him may have been the final act, but the tragedy had been unfolding for years. Elsie Woodward believed her son was murdered. She believed Anne had planned it. She believed justice had been denied because money and influence had intervened, and she spent the rest of her life grieving not just for William, but for the family name, for the scandal that could never be erased, for the grandchildren who would grow up marked by their mother's crime. She never forgave. She never relented. And she never stopped believing that the wrong person had survived that night. Whether she was right is something we will never know. The sons grew up in the shadow of October 30th, 1955. They were raised by trustees and relatives who never spoke openly about what had happened. They inherited a fortune. They inherited a name. They inherited a legacy of silence and violence and unanswered questions. What they did with that inheritance remains mostly private. They did not seek publicity. They did not write memoirs. They did not give interviews about their parents. They disappeared into the kind of quiet wealth that does not need to announce itself. Perhaps that was the only way to survive. To leave the past behind. To refuse to engage with the story that had defined their childhood. To become, as much as possible, invisible. The Woodward case asks a question that cannot be answered with certainty. What happened in the darkness of that hallway? Did Anne Woodward kill her husband deliberately? Did she fire in genuine fear? Or was it something in between? A moment where fear and opportunity converged, where self-preservation and self-defense became indistinguishable. The evidence supports multiple interpretations. The motives are clear. The opportunity was perfect. But the truth is unknowable. And perhaps that is the point. That some mysteries are not meant to be solved. That some questions are more important than their answers. That ambiguity is sometimes the most honest response to a story built on silence. What we are left with is this: a mansion in Oyster Bay, a shotgun fired in the dark, a marriage that ended in violence, a family that closed ranks, a society that whispered but never spoke openly, an investigation that concluded quickly, a woman who lived 20 years under suspicion and chose death over continued judgment, a writer who turned tragedy into fiction and destroyed himself in the process, and a question that still echoes 70 years later. Was it an accident? Or was it something else? The answer died with Anne Woodward on October 10th, 1975. The question remains, and it will remain as long as the story is told. Because the story is not really about guilt or innocence. It is not really about whether Anne pulled the trigger deliberately or in panic. It is about the cost of living in a world where image matters more than truth, where silence is enforced, where power protects its own, where the beautiful and the broken are consumed by the same forces that created them, where marriages become performances, where wealth creates pressure that can crush people, where the price of admission is sometimes more than anyone should have to pay. The shooting at the Playhouse was not just a tragedy. It was a revelation, a glimpse behind the curtain of privilege, a reminder that wealth does not protect against suffering, that mansions can be prisons, that the people who seem to have everything are sometimes the ones who have lost the most. Anne Woodward wanted a life. She fought for it. She married for it. She endured humiliation and rejection for it. And in the end, whether she killed William or not, that life killed her. Not on October 30th, 1955, but slowly, over 20 years, until she could no longer bear the weight of what she had done, or what she had been accused of doing, or what the world believed she had done. In the end, it did not matter which was true. The result was the same. She was destroyed by the shooting, by the investigation, by the whispers, by Truman Capote, by a society that never forgave, by her own choices and the consequences that followed. She had wanted to belong. She had wanted to be Mrs. William Woodward Jr. She had wanted to prove she was worthy, and she had succeeded. For a time, until it all came apart on a dark October morning in a hallway where a gun was fired and a man died, and nothing was ever the same again. The question remains, and it echoes still, in the house that still stands, in the society pages that still tell the story, in the books and articles and documentaries that still try to answer what cannot be answered. Was it an accident? Was it murder? Was it something in between? We will never know. Not with certainty. Not in a way that satisfies everyone. The evidence is gone. The witnesses are dead. The silence is permanent. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps some stories are meant to remain unresolved. Perhaps some questions are more valuable than answers. Perhaps the mystery itself is the point. What we know for certain is this. William Woodward Jr. died on October 30th, 1955. Anne Woodward died on October 10th, 1975. 20 years apart. Both deaths connected by a single moment, a single decision, a single shot fired in the dark. Everything else is interpretation. Everything else is theory. Everything else is us trying to make sense of something that may have no sense to make, trying to find truth in a story built on lies and silence and the careful construction of appearances. Trying to understand people whose lives were performances, whose marriages were transactions, whose tragedies were managed like public relations problems. The shooting at the Playhouse remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of American society. Not because we lack information, but because the information we have supports too many conclusions. Because the people involved took their secrets to the grave. Because money and influence closed the case before justice could be served or denied. Because the truth was less important than the appearance of propriety. Because that is how that world worked, and perhaps still works, in the shadows of great wealth, where power is exercised quietly, where scandals are contained, where questions go unanswered, where the beautiful houses hide dark secrets, and where the cost of keeping those secrets is sometimes measured in lives.